Ever wonder, like, what really counts as knowledge?
Hmm.
I mean, we use that word all the time, but, what does it actually mean? Well, you're in for a real treat today because we are going to tackle that very question head on with Plato's dialogue, Theaetetus.
Ooh, Theaetetus.
Yeah.
That's a fun one. It's a good one.
It's so good.
It's packed with debate, colorful characters. I think it will really make you kind of rethink how you understand the world. It's got all those great philosophical puzzles.
And you know what I love about it? It's not some,
Yeah.
dusty, boring lecture. It's like we're just dropped right into the middle of this lively conversation
Yeah.
between Socrates,
Yeah.
the famous philosopher, and this bright young Athenian named Theaetetus, who's just back from a battlefield.
Yeah, he's coming straight from the battlefield.
Talk about a dramatic entrance.
Right. And what's interesting, too, is that Socrates sees something special in this young guy. Like, he's on the verge of, like, a huge intellectual breakthrough.
It's like he's about to give birth to a new idea.
Yeah, and that's no coincidence, because this whole dialogue is full of, like, birth imagery. Socrates is acting like a midwife, helping these ideas come to light. And I think Plato's really hinting at this idea of, like, how we discover knowledge. It's like a process of intellectual labor.
So, like, what is this big idea that Theaetetus is about to deliver?
Well,
He starts off by saying that, knowledge is simply what we perceive, is what we see, what we hear, what we touch,
yeah.
what we smell, what we taste, all that. And that feels, kind of intuitive at first.
It really does. And it kind of echoes a very famous statement by the philosopher Protagoras, who said, "Man is the measure of all things." And basically what that means is that reality is subjective,
Yeah.
up to each individual's perception.
I like that. And then Plato gives us this really cool example. So imagine the wind.
Yeah.
It feels cold to one person, but not at all to another person. So is the wind itself cold?
Yeah.
Or is it only cold because of how that person experiences it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how much of what we call, reality is just shaped by our own senses,
Yeah.
our own individual senses.
Totally. But of course, Socrates is not one to let any idea go unexamined.
Right.
So he points out that our senses can be fooled,
Yeah.
Think about dreams or illusions.
Yeah.
If we're basing knowledge just on our senses alone and our senses can be wrong, well, that means knowledge can be wrong. And that's a problem.
Right. It's a huge problem. And Socrates, he just knows how to shake things up.
Yeah.
And he does it in such a, witty and playful way.
Yeah.
I love that about him. There's this one part where he compares himself to a midwife who can't give birth herself,
Oh, yeah.
but can help others deliver their ideas. It's like he's not claiming to have all the answers, but he's this master at pushing people to think critically.
Totally. It's not about, winning the argument. It's about challenging those assumptions. And he brings in this really powerful idea actually called flux. Have you ever heard of this?
Lux.
Yeah. So imagine reality is like a constantly flowing river. Everything is changing.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is in motion. Everything's becoming something else.
Whoa.
If that's the case.
Yeah.
How can we ever have any, fixed, reliable knowledge?
Yeah. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So is he saying our senses are useless
Yeah.
and we can't know anything?
Well, not necessarily. What he's highlighting is this need to go beyond just perceiving something
Okay.
to truly knowing it. So there's a difference between seeing a mirage in the desert and then understanding that it's an optical illusion. That's the kind of deeper understanding that Socrates is after.
Okay, so we've kind of established that knowledge is more complex than what our senses are telling us.
Mm.
But the dialogue, it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
Plato keeps taking us deeper, like introducing all these other layers to this puzzle of knowledge.
Yeah. It feels like Plato is just taking us on this incredible, intellectual workout, you know? Making us question everything we thought we knew
Totally.
about, how we understand the world.
He's definitely making us flex those mental muscles.
Yeah.
And just when you think you're starting to grasp this idea of knowledge as more than just perception,
Yeah.
he brings in a whole other group of thinkers who believed in this idea of the one and the many.
Okay, so break that down for me. What is the one and the many?
Okay, so basically, some philosophers like Parmenides, they believed that everything in the universe is ultimately one single, unchanging, eternal thing. Kind of the opposite of Heraclitus and his whole flux theory.
Right, so it's like on one side we've got, the flux folks saying everything's always changing, and then we have the one folks saying that everything's actually static.
Exactly. It's a philosophical tug of war.
Right, a tug of war. And Socrates even jokes about this, he's like, I feel like a wrestler caught in the middle of this. I'm being pulled in both directions. So he decides to kind of tackle this flux idea first, see if there's any solid ground there.
Okay. how do they even begin to untangle that knot? I mean, if everything's always changing, how can we know anything for sure?
Well, Socrates is the master of breaking down these complex ideas. So he starts by making this distinction between two types of motion.
Okay.
First, there's the obvious kind, right? Something moving from one place to another, like a ball flying through the air.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty simple.
But I'm sure Socrates doesn't stop there.
Oh, Socrates. He's got to go deeper. So he brings in a second kind of motion, which is change.
Okay.
Think about like a leaf changing color,
Right.
milk turning sour, even a caterpillar transforming into a butterfly. That's motion too.
Right.
It's just a different kind.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah.
So if everything is in motion, including things like changing their very nature, like how can we even define what something is?
Exactly. Like if a white flower is constantly changing its shade of white,
Yeah.
can we really say it's truly white?
Right.
And if our senses themselves are in flux, can we trust them to give us accurate information?
Right. It's like trying to build a house on quicksand.
Yeah.
Everything feels so shaky and uncertain. Does this mean like the whole idea of knowledge just falls apart?
Well, Socrates doesn't give us like a definitive answer,
Okay.
but he's definitely highlighting the problems of taking this flux theory too far. It seems to lead to some pretty absurd conclusions.
So are we back to square one? If we can't trust our senses and everything's in constant flux, how can we know anything at all?
Well, remember, Socrates is all about questioning assumptions,
Right.
pushing us to think deeper. He's not necessarily saying that knowledge is impossible,
Okay.
but he's showing us that it's way more complicated than we might think
Right.
at first.
So where do we go from here? Do we just throw up our hands and say, well, I guess we can't know anything for sure?
Not quite. So remember, Plato is not just trying to like tear down ideas.
Okay.
He's also hinting at like a more nuanced and sophisticated way of understanding knowledge.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What is this more sophisticated approach?
Okay, so instead of just accepting Protagoras' idea,
Yeah.
man is the measure of all things,
Yeah.
meaning each individual's perception is their own truth.
Right.
Socrates starts to poke some holes in that.
Yeah, how does he do that?
Well, he brings up the fact that people often disagree about what's true.
Right.
So if everyone's opinion is equally valid, then Protagoras has to accept the opinions of those who think he's wrong.
Oh.
It's kind of a clever way of showing those contradictions in that argument.
So is he saying there's no such thing as subjective truth? Like my favorite color being blue is somehow objectively wrong?
Not necessarily. He concedes that when it comes to like personal preferences, Protagoras might have a point.
Yeah.
But when we're talking about bigger questions,
Yeah.
like justice, morality, or knowledge itself, things where we need some kind of shared understanding of truth, it's not so simple.
That makes sense. It can't just be a free-for-all where everyone gets to decide their own version of reality, especially when it comes to these huge issues that affect everyone.
Exactly. And this is where Socrates introduces this idea that maybe a wise person, someone with expertise, is a better measure of truth in those areas. After all, we don't go to just anyone for medical advice. We seek out doctors, people who have specialized knowledge
Right.
and experience.
Okay, that makes sense. We value expertise in, so many areas of life. But how does this apply to knowledge itself?
Well, Socrates is hinting that true knowledge might require something more than just individual perception.
Okay.
There might be objective standards or principles that we need to grasp to truly know something, and that's where things get really interesting.
This reminds me of that flux idea again.
Uh-oh.
If everything is always changing, even our own senses and perceptions,
Yeah.
how can we ever grasp those objective standards?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's a question that Plato will continue to explore in the next part of this dialogue.
Ooh, I can't wait.
He's really challenging us to think deeply about the nature of knowledge,
Yeah.
the role of our senses and our experiences, and even our own limitations in shaping what we know and how we know it.
Okay, so we've kind of journeyed through this whirlwind of ideas
Yeah.
with Plato,
Yeah.
examining all these different theories of knowledge, from perception to the flux to the one.
Right.
But it feels like he's left us hanging a little bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Like without a clear-cut answer
Yeah.
to the question, what is knowledge?
Well, and that's exactly the point. Plato isn't giving us like a simple definition or like a solution on a silver platter.
Yeah.
What he's doing is he's inviting us to continue the search, to grapple with these questions ourselves.
It's like he's saying, here are the intellectual tools. Here are some of the concepts.
Mhm.
Now you go explore. You discover for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, in a way, makes this dialogue even more relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we live in a world just like overflowing with information and opinions and claims to truth.
Right.
But Plato is encouraging us to really develop that critical mindset,
Yeah.
to not just accept what we're told, but to, analyze and question and form our own conclusions.
Yeah. Thinking back to Theaetetus,
Yeah.
that bright young man at the center of this dialogue.
Yeah.
What strikes me is his willingness to be challenged, to have his ideas questioned.
Yeah.
It feels like he embodies that ideal of like a lifelong learner.
He totally does. And there's something so refreshing about his eagerness to engage in these philosophical debates,
Yeah.
even when they get really complex and challenging. He's such a great model for anyone who's genuinely curious about the world and really wants to understand it better.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder, though, what happens when we hit those moments of doubt?
Right.
When the ground feels shaky and we're not sure what to believe anymore, does Plato offer any guidance for navigating those uncertain waters?
He doesn't give us a step-by-step guide, but I
Right.
think he gives us some pretty valuable clues.
Okay.
Remember that analogy of Socrates as the midwife?
Yeah.
It suggests that knowledge isn't something that we just passively receive. It's something that we actively participate in bringing to light. So it's a process of questioning and examining and refining and even sometimes letting go of old ideas to make way for new ones.
So it's not about having all the answers, but more about embracing that journey of discovery,
Exactly.
the ongoing search for understanding.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what true knowledge really is.
Mm.
The willingness to keep learning, to keep questioning, to never stop exploring the complexities of the world.
I think you've hit on something really profound there. It's not about arriving at some fixed destination. It's about cultivating that intellectual curiosity and that spirit of inquiry that keeps us engaged, keeps us growing, and ultimately, I think, leads us closer to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe.
What a fantastic takeaway. It's like Plato has given us this incredible gift, this realization that the pursuit of knowledge is a lifelong adventure, full of challenges, but also, full of these incredible rewards.
Yeah.
And while he may not have given us, all the answers, he's definitely provided us with the tools that we need to embark on that journey. He's shown us the importance of careful definition and analyzing arguments and being open to different perspectives. And above all, never being afraid to ask why.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Theaetetus, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. Inspired by that image of the constantly flowing river, if everything is in flux, including ourselves, how do we make sense of our place in this ever-changing world? What are those anchors that help us navigate the currents of experience and find meaning amidst all this constant transformation?
That's a great question, one worthy of its own deep dive. And I really encourage each of you to continue exploring these ideas to see where your own intellectual journeys take you. Keep those minds sharp, keep those questions coming, and as always, keep diving deep.